Hey, so I wanted to make a quick video talking about some of the more advanced uses of the fracture tools that I've sort of discovered and worked out while working on my Chaos Bot destruction system. So by default, the documentation for the fracture editor is pretty limited. It only really talks about kind of surface level use of the tools they provide us, which work really well for assets like this, like these pots, where all you're really expecting is a fairly simple Voronoi fracture. But if you have more advanced assets like this barrel asset here, that you want to see some more interesting fractures that fit the object a little better, then the documentation as well, like a lot of tutorials and even Epic's own live stream don't really go into some of those kinds of uses for their fracturing tools. So I want to go over some of the methods they provide us and how they can be used in more interesting contexts. And some examples here. A good one is this barrel that I've fractured using a radial fracture on the sides to get this vertical slicing pattern that matches the vertical pattern of the wood material I've applied to it, and then given it a noise fracture on each piece individually, so that when it breaks, you get this cool kind of multi-level fracture on the barrel that works well. When it kind of splits apart like this, it looks like it's been under pressure, it looks like it's being fractured from a horizontal angle. Works really well on these ones too. And it doesn't run too terribly, my frame rate's going to dip because I'm recording. But it is worth considering that the more bones and the more fracture levels you have on an object, the lower the performance is going to be. So I've got a basic cube here that I've just made a quick geometry collection for, nothing special. It's just got one fracture level, which for some reason I can't select. There we go. And I'll run through each tool sort of one by one and show what they all do. So this is the same stuff that Epic shows you, the uniform fracture, which is just a very simple 3D Voronoi pattern where it picks up X number of Voronoi sites, or a number between min and max, and randomizes that based on the values you input. So a value of 10 and 20 will give you a value somewhere between there. A value of 10 and 10 will give you a maximum of 10 points. If we fracture that, then we'll get one piece per point. And we can do a multi-level fracture using this as well. If we select one of the bones we created and fracture it, then we get exactly the same thing that the cluster fracture gives us, with different points here. So let's reset the geo collection and hopefully let me select it properly. Okay, there we go. So the cluster fracture, which is the second one, I should mention that the uniform fracture works really well for things like concrete and like clay objects, things that are going to shatter in like a really chunky uniform pattern that don't really have a grain to them. And the cluster fracture works in exactly the same way, but it's kind of just doing a uniform fracture, but on multiple levels of the object. So it'll run a uniform fracture on the first level, and then run another one on the second level, third level, etc., depending on how many clusters you input here. So if I run a fracture on this, you can sort of see that it's doing exactly that. It's kind of fracturing within the fractured areas, and it does make for a more interesting pattern, but it is still pretty limited in what you can do. And as well as that, you do kind of want to have a bit more control over the fracture and the way that if I can select that bone, the uniform fracture gives you. So that one's good for the same things that the uniform fracture is: your clay, your stone objects, concrete. But I'd still suggest using the uniform over the cluster, because it just gives you that extra level of control over the result. So the third one that we've got is the radial fracture, and this is the one that Epic uses examples like glass and objects that you could expect to sort of fracture from a single point. So maybe like a concrete wall that got hit in the middle or something. The issue with this is that if it's going to fracture like this in this like kind of spiderweb pattern, it should be dynamic as to where the center of it is. So if a bullet hits a glass pane right in the middle, this will look great. But if it hits it on the top left quadrant, it's going to look really odd that it fractures from the middle. So by default, in the use cases that are provided in the documentation and in the live streams, it's kind of hard to see where this would actually be useful. but I used it for the barrel down there to get that kind of radial vertical fracture, and you can kind of see that result happening through the transparency on this object. We are getting this kind of, straight through pattern. If I increase the radial steps, not the radial steps, decrease the radial steps and increase the angular steps, you can see we're getting this like pizza slice pattern, which was really useful for the barrel, which you can imagine being, this round shape, and I can slice through each of the segments in the barrel's material. So that one's, it's a bit specific in its use case, but it is useful, in the right context. Now, the plane fracture is for, very specific slices, like if you want to be really accurate with where you're cutting the object. The plane fracture is really good, and you can rotate it and stuff too, which is great. One of the issues with it is that you can't only fracture where the plane is. If I fracture this, it's going to cut through the entire object, despite the visual plane only cutting through, 3/4 of it, which is, both good and bad. If you wanted to be really, really precise, this wouldn't cut it, no pun intended. You would have to use the mesh fracture, which I'll go over in a moment. But one use I found for the plane fracture is to provide cuts in objects in like mostly cluster level 2 or 3 bones, like for the barrel here in the middle of the object. You have a lot of precision over where you're placing your cuts, but it does, like I said, it cuts through the entire selection that you have. So if you're on level 1, it's going to cut through the entire mesh, and that may not be ideal. Now it does support noise, which is good. If I reset this, reselect the bone, and then add some amplitude, decrease the point spacing, and increase the frequency, you can see it does have a noise effect on it as well, which is really nice. It increases the potential use case of this object quite a bit. And it supports grout too, which means that if I increase the grout amount and do that fracture, select the object first, then fracture it, it's going to give us that in-between point of the plane division. So the next one is the slice, which I found to be really, really useful for objects that have a grain to them, so wood being one of them. I used it for the wood pieces here, because you can make your vertical slices and add randomness to the exact angle of the slice. It means that you can have, you can make that kind of wood grainy look. Another one that I used it for was the table, which I can bring out quickly. This one here. Let's turn the bone colors on, and you can see the way it's been fractured using the slice pattern. And when I break it, it does have that kind of, I'll just get through all that stuff. Oh no, you can actually see it here. It has that kind of wood, fracture along the grain effect that that you see on broken wood objects. And if you weren't worried about performance, you could really go heavy on this and make it give it a lot of fractured points, and you can give it some cool particles and stuff to make it look very realistic. This is meant to run, in a real-time situation where you could have a lot of these breaking at once, so I didn't want to go too heavy, but you could very easily go quite heavy with it. Now, I'll show that on here real quick. If I go to the slice fracture, and let's say that this is a wood pattern running vertically along here, what you can do is you can take your Y slices, or your Y slices are the ones you want vertically, and I'll increase my X slices to maybe 2, the Z slices to 2, and increase the X slices to 5. So you can consider this to work the same as the plane cuts, but with lots of them, if that makes sense. If I make a fracture now, you'll see the result. So it comes with this like brick-like pattern almost, which isn't actually particularly useful by itself, but once you start to add noise to it, or once you start to add this random angle variation, I should say, you can see it already starting to happen, where it kind of, gives us this random angle on the plane cuts. There's also a random offset variation, so you can get a different size for each piece. And now we're starting to get this sort of more randomized, more follow the grain kind of situation. The only issue is that it's all following the same kind of uniform randomness, and that it's all randomizing towards this angle as opposed to this angle. So one thing I found to be quite helpful here is if you run a second slice over it without as many divisions, and do it on a negative angle variation. So if I do negative 15 there, we run that fracture, and we're now getting a much more interesting slice pattern. Now there are uniform slices running across the horizontal, but you could very easily do this, add your horizontal slices after everything else. If I play the game now and let this fall, you'll see it sort of breaking into this. Unfortunately, it's only broken on the first clustered level, but you can kind of see it breaking into sort of this grained pattern where the pieces are often falling into longer slices as opposed to uniform slices. Now, obviously, the downside here is the performance of it, because this is a lot of fractured pieces. It's 809 pieces on the level 2 fracture. But if you didn't need to run a lot of these breaking at once, you didn't need to run it in real time, it wouldn't really be an issue. So I'll reset that one more time and take a look at the brick fracture. Now, this is the one that I've noticed the least utility for. I don't really know exactly what the idea behind this one was. Maybe it would be good for a displaced brick wall object, perhaps. But other than that, it's a bit hard to see where the use case lies. Even if I reduce the brick height and the depth and all that to get a more standard pattern, we're still only really getting the same result that is offered by the slice tool. Now I also don't know what's going on with the grout part of it. It has a very slight division in the middle here between the pieces. So if I go back to the brick fracture now, did I have? Yeah, I didn't even have grout turned on, and it still had that strange division in it. So when I drop it, yeah, it has this sort of single object grout piece, which I'm not sure quite what the intention is, but I would generally avoid using that and use the slice fracture over it. But maybe I'm missing some potential use case for this one. Now the mesh fracture is a really interesting one. This is it's almost like a Boolean operation in a lot of ways. So if I bring out a brand new mesh from the place actors panel, I'll grab a cylinder. And it's going to be a bit hard to bring into the right location, so I'll just bring it up here and down a little. So we're intersecting our object. And if I decrease the size a little bit, so we've got a cylinder shape running through it, what we can do is we can select the bone, go into the mesh fracture mode, and you can select a cutting actor, which you can see here. So if I pick actor from source, pick the static mesh actor, and run our fracture, what we have, if I just hide this real quick, is a fracture going straight through the center of the mesh. So it really does work exactly how a Boolean operation does. And this wouldn't fracture very nicely when I dropped it, but if I then say ran a simple uniform fracture on this and this, when we drop it, that's going to fall apart on the first. Whoops. That was an interesting falling pattern, but you can see that the cylinder part has stayed inside and it's kind of fractured the inside like that. Now I haven't found a use case for this in my own work yet, but I'm sure there are good uses for it if you're trying to fracture something that's a little more stone-like or something more mechanical. So that's very cool. I think that's quite a good addition to the fracture mode. Now one use case I found for that as well in my work on the prop destruction system is in this asset here, this box. When I produced it, I neglected to make the side panels here a separate mesh object, and because of that, what I did instead was I pulled out a simple cube, and when I was on the first fracture level, which is, how do I get to there? Fracture level 1, you can see that I've got separate objects here and here and here, because what I did was I brought a cube out and intersected it with this area to cut out the wooden slats and allow me to sort of work with everything on a lower level beyond that. So in the end, we get this sort of fractured effect where the wood slats are separate to the rest of it. And if I go ahead and break one of those, you'll see what I mean. Here, each wooden piece in the middle kind of breaks on its own instead of having having to fracture as a whole that I would if I had used, say, a uniform fracture right out of the box, or even a slice fracture right out of the box, which is great because it means that I don't have to, go back into my 3D software and make sure the objects are separate, depending on how I want them to look in the end. So to quickly go over one more thing that I found, I want to have a look at this asset here, which is sort of it's an open-top version of the same barrel that I've been demonstrating before, but I haven't fractured this one properly. All I've done with it is done a slice fracture through the middle, which you can see going on here, and then run a uniform fracture on what was left. And what's interesting about running your initial fracture on an object like this is that it will automatically assign bones to separate mesh pieces. So I'll reset it to its base object and show you exactly what I mean. If I select this piece and then run a planar fracture right through the middle, it's still got grout running on it, I'll just turn that off. There we go. Run a slice right in the middle. What you'll see happening is it's already assigned separate bones to all of the disconnected pieces of the mesh, and that's really, really nice because it means that objects like this, where you really don't want it fracturing as a whole, you want it fracturing piece by piece, can sort of automatically be set up in that way. Now, the downside of this is you can't trigger this state without first fracturing something. So in order to get this sort of hierarchy where you have each piece of the mesh separated by, whether it's connected to the main part or not, you need to make an initial fracture. So I'll reset this, and to kind of get that initial fracture going, I'm just going to make a tiny little slice on like the top part of the object with no noise on it. So it's a very simple plain slice. So I'll just move this plane up and turn off snapping. So I'm intersecting like the tiniest little bit of the object like this. So you can only just see that it's making like a tiny intersection on the edge here and nowhere else. And if I fracture it, what's going to happen is it's going to make this slice fracture, right? But it's going to make the every other piece here its own object as well, its own bone, which is fantastic because now I actually have individual control over how each of these individual bits fractures. The only problem, of course, being that I've got this tiny little awful fractured piece here, this bone here that I probably don't want. And thankfully, Epic has provided us with a tool that lets us clean up these tiny little fractures that will cause performance issues and will look terrible. If we select the two bits that we, all the pieces that we might potentially want to merge back together, and you go down to the bottom under Utilities, there's a GeoMerge option. And what this does is it merges pieces of geometry into their neighbors, meaning that this one will merge into this one, and it's based on the size of the object. So there's a slider here for relative volume, and as you turn this up and down, it'll start to highlight pieces that you can then have put back, merged back into their neighbors. There's also 1-2 merge selected, which I haven't found to. It's useful if you want to put something back together, but generally I don't like to use this one. I'd rather just make the fracture good to begin with. So I'll leave this turned off. Now, when we have this little red highlight on the object, all we have to do is hit merge geometry, and it puts it back into a mesh. Now, I think one issue that hopefully will be addressed at some point is that it doesn't actually merge it back as it was. It just kind of mashes the pieces together. So the polygons that we've created when we created that slice are still going to be there. They're just not visible, which isn't ideal, but it's also only 4 polygons, so it's not a huge problem. But if you had a more complex object, it could be more of an issue. So now that we have each piece fractured separately, I think these rings are pretty much done. I don't think they need any more corrections made to them because the metal shouldn't fracture, it should bend, but there's no soft body physics in Geometry Collections yet. So I can't do anything about that, but what I can do is ensure that this sort of center object here can have radial slices going around the outside of it, so that each piece can have its own, each piece of the mesh, each piece of the material can have its own piece of the geometry collection. So I think I showed it earlier with this one, but what we can do is just turn on the radial fracture and set it to the same number of divisions we have going around the edge of the mesh. So I believe I have 16 in this. I think that looks right. And because the radial fracture has currently no radial step set up, all that's going to do is set out a fracture going from the center of the object out to the edges of the selected part of the object. So I've got this bone selected, and all I have to do is line up the radial fracture with the geometry collection that I'm working with. So if I zoom in here, I'll be able to see it more clearly, and I'll just rotate a little bit, and that looks about right. So I can then hit fracture, and going back into perspective mode, we can see that I've got a separate piece for each part of the geometry collection, which I think is really great. And if I then go back into play, just got a big lag spike. If I go ahead and hit one of these objects, you can see it's going to fracture. Okay, it actually isn't doing what I thought it would do. I'll try this one. Okay. I'll just quickly see if that's a issue with the barrel prop itself. I might have turned the maximum fracture threshold onto something too low. So geo collection, clustering. Oh yeah, okay, I set the max cluster level too low. So I'll just reset that. There we go. So now it's working as expected. So when we fracture this now, the tension of the the wood being fractured out will splay it, and then each piece of wood, as it should theoretically be, will fracture into its own piece. Now it's not quite as nice as this one is yet, because I've got fractures going horizontally on that one too, but that's pretty easy to add. All we have to do to get that going is head back over to the geo collection, head into fracture mode, and grab each piece individually with a I could do a slice plane, but I think I'm actually going to use a uniform fracture here. So by default, we've got, however many fractured pieces. I'm just going to set it to a max and min of 1. And if we click on it enough times... Okay, why isn't that working? Maybe I need 2. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, I need 2 of them so I can get a single slice going into it. And do I fracture it? We'll get 2 pieces here, but what I might do is fracture it with a bit of noise. So some amplitude, increase the frequency, decrease the point spacing, and let's see how we go. Maybe a little more. Amplitude of like 4. Maybe that's too much. No, that's about right actually, so that's not terrible. That's a bad location for the fracture, so I'll do it here. Okay, let's try this one. So you can see I'm re-clicking on it as I go, so I can make sure that the fracture, which you can see the line going through it, appears in a location that's actually going to be good for the object. So I think that's a decent fracture. I'll go to this one. Might increase the frequency a little bit. Fracture this. There we go. Now we're getting some decent results with the noise. So I'll just go around the ring and fracture them each around the center point. And I won't bother doing the entire thing on camera, but when we go back into play the game, and we hit one of these, we'll be able to see that this object is now fracturing in the center points on the ones that I've set it up on, which does improve the look of the object, I think. But of course, there is the trade-off of more clustered levels and more bones, causing more performance loss when we're calculating the physics. Now, with the in the Chaos Block Destruction system, which I'll link in the description, it's available on the Unreal Marketplace, I have set it up so that the performance cost of the chaos calculating, the position and the physics of all the fractured points is recovered from pretty quickly through like an automatic sleeping and disabling system that I've set up. So you can sort of see it in action here while it's jiggling, and then it kind of settles, and at that point we're back to our regular, 70 to 80 frames per second. So I think that pretty much covers the radial fracture. The only other thing to go over is another use for the slice fracture. So one thing I've been doing with these barrels is trying to get the slices to come across the wooden pieces on the bottom, which I suppose I can see a little more clearly from the top. There we go. If I then so these aren't aligning yet, but I can actually rotate the barrel itself until we get sort of that line up there. I'll bring it a little more this way, and I'm going to turn off any of the, whoops, not that one, so I want 6 Y slices. I'll turn my X slices to 0 and my Z slices to 0, so then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections of the wood here. When I hit fracture, we get nice divisions going across the bottom, like that. And then when we rate the barrel, of course, the bottom of the barrel is going to now fracture like how we decided to. Now, in hindsight, what I probably would have done is just made sure that each wooden segment of the barrel was its own separate mesh, so that when we ran our initial fracture, it would already divide it into all the pieces we want to. But that would increase the poly count of the original model, which was what I was being conscious of at the time. But like I said, hindsight, I probably would have done that differently. But again, we're getting a pretty good result here regardless, so I'm fairly happy with how this has all turned out. I hope that covers more or less everything I wanted to talk about. I really hope that the fracture tools will get a bit more better documentation in the future, and that hopefully we can see the tools evolve and expand a little bit to have things like even a button that says just fracture by mesh element or fracture by mesh piece, so we don't have to go through this kind of slice a single piece off and then recombine it dance. But yeah, I hope that was helpful, and I'll probably post some more videos on using this system and how I've kind of set up all the physics fields and everything to work with Chaos in the future.